isn't gasketing material, or the gasket has failed. And so gas can rise through that opening left by the failed gasket and become pressurized. And that's bad, because if it becomes pressurized, it can then migrate into your underground source of drinking water. So that's one example of industry information. They can't claim they don't know this is a problem. Then we went to the industry literature. Found a paper published in 2003 by Schlumberger, the premier oil and gas field service company. That's the company that I consulted for 20 years. They hire the best and brightest. Some of them are my students. They paid for the PhD program of a bunch of my students at Cornell. Paid me consulting fees. But we weren't doing shale gas back then. We can talk about that later, about why I'm telling you about the things I'm telling you about now when I was doing this stuff sort of kind of for them years ago. All right, so in this paper they have a bar chart. First you had a graph, now you have a bar chart. Horizontal axis is the age of a well, and the vertical axis is the percentage of wells of any one age that are known to be leaking. SCP, sustained casing pressure. And I think there are three observations you can make from this graph. If you look at brand new wells that are less than a year old, 5% of them are leaking. As wells age, the leak rate goes up. And by the time wells get to maturity, depends upon whether it's a gas well, an oil well, depends upon the play, when is a well mature, certainly when it's 10 to 20 years old. By then, roughly half the wells are leaking. Now these are offshore wells. These are all wells in the Gulf of Mexico. You shouldn't take any great comfort from that. But they're offshore wells. And so when I started showing this data 2 years ago, industry pushed back using their usual blogs, the EIDs, the ANGA, saying, Ingraffea, you're full of you-know-what, because this is totally irrelevant to modern shale gas development. First of all, it's a paper that's 10 years old. It's describing wells that are as much as 40 years old, and they're offshore wells. Totally irrelevant information and data. You can't draw any conclusions from it. Okay? So I went farther into the literature, and I went to a paper published more recently, 2009. Again, through the Society of Petroleum Engineers, and these are two well-known, actually the people in this paper are also well-known. These are not midgets. These are giants from the industry. And in this case, these two petroleum engineers studied over 340,000 wells onshore, all in Canada. Oil wells and gas wells. Some shale gas wells, not many, out of 340,000. And there's a lot of data here that I'm not going to get into the details of, but again, you see young wells, low rate of failure, older wells, higher rate of failure. Look familiar? They also decided to look at one particular test area where there were a lot of deviated wells. Modern deviated wells, directionally drilled. And what they found is that the test area average, this is sustained casing vent flow, the well is leaking. This is gas migration. That's the inspector goes to the wellhead, doesn't see any flow, but they put gas sensors a couple meters away from the wellhead, down in the ground, and those sensors detect methane migration through the ground. And what they find is that for deviated wells, the combined rate of failure is close to 70%. All shale gas wells, by definition, are deviated. They're directionally drilled. It's well known in the industry that it's much more difficult to cement, i.e. gasket, a well that is not straight than to gasket a well that is straight. We're getting at this issue of how frequently can we predict a well to fail. But again, I show this data, industry pushes back, ANGA pushes back, EID pushes back and says, they're Canadian wells. Knowing what I know about Canadian regulations and Pennsylvania regulations, I would rather be regulated by the province of British Columbia than the state of Pennsylvania. And they said, well, there are very few shale gas wells here. It's not representative of modern technology. So then, about 3 weeks ago, I was in Denver. You're not going to believe this. I get invited to the North American Wellbore Integrity Workshop. It's amazing how the industry can claim it's not a problem, and yet they publish papers that says it's a problem. They have workshops that they could. Schlumberger was the principal sponsor of the workshop. Why? Well, Schlumberger's business model, Halliburton's business model, BJ Services' business model was a very interesting business model. It's sort of like my father-in-law and my mother-in-law. One was an obstetrician, the other was a pathologist. Think about that. Are they ever going to go broke? You didn't get that joke. They got them coming and going. Same thing with, okay, so what does Schlumberger, Halliburton, what do? They drill wells, they case wells, they cement wells, they also repair them. So I'm at this workshop, and I'm the keynote speaker the first day. I still have lots of friends at Schlumberger. They still respect me, I still respect them, so they invite me to talk on what I'm going to tell you tonight. And then the next day, they brought up George King. George King is the self-appointed anti-Tony. Wherever I go, George goes. When I write a paper, George writes a contradictory paper. George is extremely well known. He has his own consulting firm. Here it is, George King Consulting. You can go to that website and see that he advertises how to detect when a well is failing and how to repair it. And his talk at the workshop 3 weeks ago was, wells don't fail. This is data from his website. Let's see, well life prior to casing leak in years, wells developing leaks. What do you notice? Look familiar? Same pattern. Young wells leak somewhere around 2, 3, 4, 5%. The older the wells get, the more they leak, and eventually when they're mature, they're leaking up in the 30, 40, 50% range. We weren't satisfied. So we went to a primary source of information. The Columbus, Ohio Dispatch. Anybody here from Columbus? This is a headline from August 8th of this year. Gas leaks from shale wells are rare. Well, we could have stopped right then and took their word for it. But that's not exactly a peer-reviewed source of information, nor was any of the other stuff I just showed you peer-reviewed. Just because a document produced by the oil and gas industry has the SPE imprimatur on it, and it looks like a paper, it's got a title, it's got the authors, it's got the affiliations, it's got the abstract, it's got an introduction, it's got the methods, it's got results, it's got conclusions, it has citations, it looks like a paper, smells like a paper, feels like a paper. It ain't a paper, because it's not peer-reviewed. For those of you who don't know what peer review is, we can talk about that during Q&A. But literally, when SPE puts out a paper, like the ones I just showed you, in the fine print on the front, it says, this paper is not peer-reviewed. So one has to worry about the value, the vettedness, the accuracy, the validity of information in these documents. So we do it ourselves. So we decided 2 years ago to start doing our own study, that we were going to confront head-on all the criticisms that we receive about using industry data. That was not shale gas. That was not modern. That did not come from a place with the toughest regulations in the world. So what did we do? We went to Pennsylvania, and we went to the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection SPUD database and compliance database. It's the state with the toughest regulations in the world. Modern shale gas, 60 to 80 operators, a good inhomogeneous distribution of operators, broad region, northeastern Pennsylvania, southwestern Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania, central Pennsylvania. And we said, okay, let's get as much data as we can out of this database, and we decided that we were going to look at 41,381 gas and oil wells drilled in Pennsylvania between January 1st, 2000 and December 31st, 2012. That's how many were drilled. 41,381. Oil wells, gas wells, coal bed methane wells, conventional, unconventional.
You look at water wells?
No, it's not in this database. When I use the word unconventional, I use it the same way that industry uses it and the Pennsylvania DEP uses it. When I say unconventional, I mean shale, tight sand, or coal bed methane. There are no tight sand wells in that database, and there are only 2 or 3 coal bed methane wells. So from now on, for the rest of the evening, when I say unconventional, interpret that to mean shale gas. So there's 4 things we had to do, and I'm going to go through them sequentially. First, we had to create the database. Then we had to mine the database, extract information from data. Then we projected forward in time and asked, given the information we've learned from the first 6,000 shale gas wells and the other 35,000 oil and gas wells in Pennsylvania, what we've learned about the rate of their failure, do we now have an adequate statistical basis to make a forward prediction in time? And I'm going to show you the results. First time in public tonight. So first, the database. What did we do? We went to the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection Office of Oil and Gas Management webpage. You can do that tonight. And we downloaded all the SPUD reports and all the compliance reports. Voluminous amounts of data. 75,000 inspection reports. Over 75,000 for 41,381 wells. First thing we noticed as we were making sure that we had a valid database is to notice that 8,703 of those wells show no record of inspection. That doesn't mean they weren't inspected. Could mean they weren't inspected, ever. Remember, some of these wells are 12 years, or 13 years old. And we can tell you now, because we have all the data, which wells were inspected when, by whom, where. All that information is in the public domain. You can go get it yourself. But it's very tedious. So we don't have any information on 8,700 wells. We also found there were 5,223 wells where the date of inspection came before the date the well was drilled. Data entry error, 5,223 times. All right, so that's called noise. You can't process data that's noise. You can't process data you don't have, and you can't process data that you know is incorrect. Because what we're trying to do is predict in time what a well is likely to do, and since we don't really know whether the SPUD date was correct or the inspection date was correct, you threw that data out. So what we're left with was 27,500 wells and 75,000 inspections. And we had to read them all. All right, so how do you read the data? How do you read all this information? It's in the form of spreadsheets. Right, so inspector goes to the well, checks off a lot of boxes, maybe makes some comments, maybe issues violations. All that handwritten stuff gets translated into a spreadsheet, a gigantic spreadsheet on your database, DADEP database. So since it's translated into a spreadsheet, it's computer mineable. Cool. That's what data mining is. You use software to extract information from data. 3 steps. We thought would only take 1 step, wound up taking 3 steps. So let me explain. Naively, we thought that every well that had an inspection, some wells had none, so we threw them out. Some wells had 1, kept them in. Some wells had multiple inspections, kept all those in. We naively thought that if an inspector went to a well and saw that the well was leaking, in the violations portion of this database, there would be a check mark. Well is leaking, violation. That's what we thought. So we ran all the numbers and said, well, that's strange. Something doesn't add up here. Because when we read the comments which are also in the database, there are far more comments that allude to wells failing than there are violations. Uh-oh. Oh, we better use a second filter. So then we went into the inspection comments and violation comment fields on this spreadsheet and searched for certain keywords like well fail, bubbling in the cellar, failed casing, inadequate cement job. There's all kinds of words that you can use to describe the well as leaking. So we had to program that all in. But since this is all being done with software now, we had to make sure that the program wasn't making any errors, and we had to make sure that we hadn't made any errors programming it. So then we went back and read everything. We, not me. Renee did. Renee Santoro, who's a real trooper. So then we human read thoroughly to confirm that, in fact, what the software was pulling out of data was, in fact, evidence gathered by an inspector on one or more inspections that a particular well was exhibiting loss of zonal isolation, sustained casing pressure, sustained casing vent flow, annular gas, all those things. And different inspectors called the same thing different things. There's no uniformity, there are no standards. Different inspectors will see the same thing and call it something different. So you have to be careful. All right, here are the violation codes. I asked you earlier tonight, if you were an inspector and you saw the bubbling I showed you in that video, would you issue a violation? You said, sure. Well, which one do you want to issue?